So this happened around 2008. My buddy Brock had gotten out of the military after 10 years. He'd started in the Marines but transitioned into the Army for the last 4 years before buying a house in Texas. When he got out, he did a variety of jobs before landing a gig with a repo service. He worked there for a year and had a lot of wild stories, but this one sticks out the most as he helped a fellow soldier get revenge on an evil ex. Brock was at the office speaking with his manager, whom I'll refer to as Karen. Now, this particular Karen had a lot of Karen-like qualities, but was a force for good, if you can believe that. While they were talking, they saw a young man enter the office. They immediately noticed he had 2 black eyes and an arm was in a sling. The young man, whose name I unfortunately never learned but I'll call Ben, asked how hard it would be for them to help repossess his car. Karen called her daughter in, Karen Jr., and had her pour Ben a cup of coffee. Karen then asked Ben to tell her a story. Ben began by telling her that he had just returned from a deployment. He had been dating a local girl that lived outside of the famous Fort Hood. Not a good idea, by the way, before the deployment. Thanks to a previous deployment, he had managed to get himself a used black Dodge Charger, which was his baby. He further explained that shortly after buying the car, he had met the local girl, who, for the sake of the story, I'll call Morgan. Morgan was always asking to drive his car, but he would always decline. When he was getting ready for his deployment, Morgan repeatedly asked if she could borrow the car, but he kept saying no. After much needling, he relented, but on the condition that she take care of his apartment until he comes back from rest and relaxation leave. She agreed. Ben left for his deployment while Morgan took care of his place. When Ben came back for leave, he found his apartment immaculate. He pulled his car from storage, drove to Morgan's. He spent a few days with her before handing her the keys and heading to his home state to visit family before returning to his deployment. He returned again from his deployment and found nothing but trouble. When he walked into his apartment, he found a layer of dust on just about every surface. It was almost like no one had been there in months. When he checked his bedroom, he'd found his room had been torn apart. All of his drawers had been searched and upturned. He tried to call Morgan but never received an answer. He located his safe, which was hidden, and found it hadn't been touched. He then grabbed his spare key from the safe, called a buddy of his, and they went to Morgan's. As they pulled up to Morgan's, he saw a car there that he initially didn't recognize, but as they got closer, he realized it was his baby. Morgan had the car painted hot pink and put 24-inch spinners on it. He tried the key just to make sure, and the lights flickered as it unlocked. While his buddy laughed, Ben went to the front door and Morgan answered. He asked what happened to his car, and she responded, "It's my car now." Ben walked away and hopped in his hot pink mess. As he started it, 4 large dudes came out of Morgan's house, one with a baseball bat, and yanked Ben out of his car. They proceeded to beat the heck out of him in the driveway before his friend intervened, pulling his conceal and carry pistol on the group. He then took Ben to the hospital. I'm honestly not sure if the cops were called on this. I'd assume yes, but even then, Ben said his friend drove by Morgan's house a handful of times while he was in the hospital at random times, and the car was never there. Karen stared at Ben for a bit before asking for the paperwork. Ben handed it to her, and Karen had a smile forming on her face. She then asked Ben for Morgan's phone number. Ben gave it but wasn't aware of what was about to happen. Karen handed the phone to Karen Jr., who then dialed the number. Karen Jr. then began speaking to Morgan, telling her that they'd met at one of the local clubs and wanted to know if she was down to party that night. Apparently, Morgan agreed, and the plan was set. Brock parked his tow truck at the club and waited. Sure enough, Morgan showed up with the pink monster, parked it, and went inside with some girlfriends. Brock gave them 5 minutes before he stealthily drove up to the car and hooked it up. As he was pulling out with the pink monster, Morgan walked out of the club. She saw her car in the tow truck and began trying to flag Brock down, but he was already out of there. The next day, it was business as usual at the office when Morgan called. She was furious that her car was stolen by them and wanted it back. Karen, using her best customer service voice, told her if she had the registration, she could come pick it up. Morgan began screaming louder that she was gonna call the cops, at which point Karen sarcastically told her, "Please do," then hung up on her. As this phone call was going on, Brock happened to look out the window and saw Morgan standing next to a car in a vacant lot, throwing what appeared to be a temper tantrum. After Karen hung up, Brock watched her get in the car on the passenger side. Karen then looked out the window and had Brock verify it was her. She then began to smirk. Karen then proceeded to call the owner of the property Morgan and her friend were occupying. She told the owner about the car and asked if he wanted it towed. The owner okayed it. Brock then drove his truck over to the ladies in the car and introduced himself. They tried to explain that they were waiting for Morgan's boyfriend, but Brock insisted they weren't allowed to park there. They argued and called him every name in the book. Brock then hooked up their car and lifted it partially off the ground, forcing the two to exit the vehicle. They tore into him until he showed them the tow order. While this back and forth was going on, Ben arrived at the office and Morgan saw him walk in. She ran to the office door and Brock proceeded to lower the car. When Brock went back to the office, all hell had broken loose. Morgan apparently tried to snag the keys back from Ben, but he pocketed them. She began to hit him in his hurt arm and warned Ben that she'd call her friends to finish the job if she didn't get her keys back. Karen Jr. had already called the cops at this point, and Brock got in between Ben and Morgan, even telling Morgan to try hitting him to find out what would happen. Morgan then tried to play the pity card and said she only wanted the keys to get her laptop out for school. Karen asked Ben to hand the keys over to Brock so he could grab the laptop. Brock retrieved the laptop from the car, and as he was handing it over, she rushed to aggressively grab it but knocked it from Brock's hands. Completely furious at this point, Morgan accused Brock of dropping the computer on purpose and threatened to sue. The cops then arrived, and Morgan began her sob story again, telling the police that they stole her car. The police questioned Karen, and Karen gave her casual smirk while asking if they wanted to see the security videos. The police watched and listened as Morgan punched Ben several times and heard the threats she made about sending her friends after him. The police then turned to Morgan, who had turned ghost white at this point. She tried to back her way to the door, but the police stopped her. They proceeded to ask about the car, Ben's injuries, and who she planned on sending after him. She initially denied everything, but they already had evidence of her beating him up. She was arrested, and Ben got his car back. After the cops left, Ben admitted he didn't want to be seen in a car that looked like it was advertising Pepto-Bismol and planned on trading it in for a GTO. We later heard through the grapevine that the 4 guys who beat up Ben were arrested. Morgan had ratted them out. Back in the early 2000s, my mom worked for a company that was a subsidiary of a now-defunct telecommunications company. We'll call it NDJ. NDJ's travel expense policy was that she had a $50 per day meal allowance. Thing was, in the long run, she'd spend less than $50 per day. She worked as a network administrator, and sometimes she'd have to fly out to Miami, Los Angeles, or wherever else in the U.S. They had a data center to help set up or repair networks and other things. She would often book a room in an extended stay hotel, the kind that often advertised their rates as being per week. These extended stays often have a kitchenette. Usually they'd have a microwave, a fridge, and a small 2-eye stove, perfect for cooking up some bachelor food. My mom would, on the day of arrival, stop at a local grocery store, Publix, Kroger, and pick up a week's worth, or however long she needed to stay, of food. She'd get frozen dinners, sandwich fixins, frozen or fresh fruit, yogurt, and a few pints of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. The total bill might come to $100, but it would last her the entire week. One day, when she submitted her receipts and expense report, accounting ripped her a new one over the $100 grocery bill. They told her, "You're only allowed to spend $50 per day, no more," she'd argue. "That was food for the entire week. I saved you money." "Doesn't matter. $50 a day." "Okay," she thought. "You want $50 a day. You got it." The next time she took a trip to Miami or elsewhere, she spent exactly $50 a day. She'd stop somewhere cheap, like McDonald's or Burger King, for breakfast, get something out of the break room vending machines for lunch, peanut butter crackers, and Diet Coke. But it was treat yourself night every night. Red Lobster, Olive Garden, or anywhere else that guaranteed a bill of at least $25 per person. She'd get the whole shebang: appetizer, entree, dessert, and a cocktail. Pretty sure the bill ran upwards of $40–50. As long as she stayed within her means, she enjoyed herself. Every single night, they didn't bat an eye. But when they saw that and compared to what it would have cost on her old system, they told her she could go back to her old system if she so desired. So, a few years ago, I worked for this dispatch agency that would contract me out to various locations. They paid me in pennies and treated me like subhuman dirt. I even had to go so far as to be identified by a number rather than name when I spoke with management. Management which I hear has just kinda collapsed in on itself due to just obviously pathetic management skill. Anyway, so this one place they contracted me out to was located far away from any train station or bus stop, and I don't own a car. So I asked how I should get there. They told me, and I confirmed with the client that there was a bus from a train station owned by the client that took employees and visitors there. So for about the first month, I took that bus every morning around 7 a.m., even though I didn't actually start work until 9:30 or 10, but that was the only bus, so I had no choice. Suddenly, one day, the managers shuffled around a bunch of employees for some reason, and I got stuck with this new guy creating the schedule who was, I think, fresh out of college and had no clue what he was doing. For some reason, he told me that I had to stop taking that bus because it was owned by the client and I don't work for the client. I work for the company. They loved to remind us of this. The client even said they didn't mind if I took their bus, as that just made the most logical sense. But no. I told them I could walk from the train station, but it was gonna take me an hour or two, and the only feasible transport besides the bus was to take a taxi, which would be a $40 trip one way, so to get back ends up $80 a day on taxes. Yeah, they're expensive in this country, so he told me to take a taxi. I straight up told him, you don't pay me enough to be able to afford a taxi. I was thinking they would capitulate and let me take the bus, but as if to pathetically assert dominance, they actually gave me an allowance for the taxes from then on. And since I could take a taxi whenever instead of waiting for the bus, I showed up to the client at 9:30 with 2 extra hours of sleep. Was actually a pretty nice setup.